The rope groaned like a dying man. Below, in the moonless dark of March 1244, the Pyrenees were a jagged maw of shadow and ice. Four figures, little more than whispers against the sheer rock face of, rappelled into the abyss, their movements economical and desperate. They did not carry gold. They carried something heavier, the memory of a faith the world was determined to forget. What they clutched in oilskin sacks was a collection of writings, a history, a truth so potent that an army of 10,000 men had been sent to choke the life from this mountain fortress. Before we follow them into the freezing night, consider subscribing. The secrets they carried were meant to stay buried with the ashes of their people, and this is only the beginning of their unearthing. For 10 months, the Royal Army of France, acting as the fist of the Papal Inquisition, had squeezed. The mountain was a citadel of last resort, a sanctuary for a people who called themselves simply the bonnes and bonnes femmes, the good men and good women. Rome had another name for them, Cathars, heretics. A cancer to be excised from the body of Christendom with fire and steel. Their crime was not violence but a belief. They believed the material world, the world of flesh and stone and papal thrones, was a creation of a lesser, malevolent God. Their God was one of spirit, light, and pure abstraction, a being entirely separate from the world you could see and touch. This was not just a theological disagreement. It was a declaration of war against the entire structure of medieval power. A church that claimed dominion over the physical world held no authority in their eyes. Sacraments, relics, the very cross itself, these were illusions, traps for the soul. And so the crusade came, not to the Holy Land but to the heart of Christian. Inside the cramped walls, huddled against the percussive shockwaves of trebuchet stones striking the ramparts, were not just soldiers. They were weavers, farmers, poets, and nobles who had fled the burnings in the lowlands. Presiding over this flock of the damned was the Cathar bishop, a man whose face was a roadmap of sorrow and conviction. He watched as the military commander, Pierre Roger Mirepoix, measured their dwindling supplies of dried meat and grain against the ever-tightening ring of enemy encampments. The smoke from those thousands of fires below was a constant, acrid reminder of their isolation. Each new dawn revealed another siege engine, another breach in their outer defenses. The whispers grew louder in the crowded halls, smelling of fear and damp wool. What was the Cathar treasure that the Crusaders were so certain lay within these walls? The Inquisition's agents, men like the Dominican friar, were convinced of a vast repository of gold and silver. They were wrong. The treasure was not something to be weighed or counted. It was contained in the pages of their Gospels, the Gospel of John interpreted through their own unique lens, the esoteric book of the Two Principles, and other texts detailing a cosmology that branded the God of the Old Testament a usurper. These were the documents that, if allowed to survive, could unravel the sanctioned narrative of Rome. Could a handful of parchments truly threaten an empire of faith? The fall of the Barbican, the fortress's key outer defensive post, came not through a heroic assault, but through the treachery of local Basque mercenaries. One night a small team of them scaled a seemingly impossible cliff face, overwhelmed the small garrison, and opened a path for the main force. The noose tightened. The grinding of the siege engines grew closer, the impacts more violent. The very rock of the mountain seemed to tremble with each blow, a constant, deep vibration that one could feel in their bones, a death rattle for their world. The defenders knew, with the cold certainty of a winter morning, that the end was no longer a possibility, but an appointment. Pierre Roger Mirepoix, a pragmatic soldier to the last, met with the Crusader commander. He negotiated a surrender, but the terms were strange. Mirepoix did not ask for his life or the lives of his knights. He asked for a truce, 15 days of peace before the final capitulation. Confident in his victory, granted it. He could not comprehend why a defeated enemy would need 2 weeks to prepare for their own destruction. It was an act of inexplicable mercy, or perhaps profound arrogance. Why would a doomed people need 15 days? The atmosphere inside transformed overnight. The terror of the siege was replaced by a serene, almost feverish sense of purpose. The noise of repair and defense ceased, replaced by the low hum of prayer and chanting. Something was being prepared, a final act of defiance more powerful than any sword or shield. And the other perfects, the spiritual elite who lived lives of extreme asceticism, moved through the crowds, there come a strange anchor in a sea of impending doom. They were not preparing for surrender. They were preparing for a coronation. On the night of March 14th, just 2 days before the truce was set to expire, a great ceremony took place in the fortress keep. More than 200 of the believers, men and women who had until now been mere or followers, came forward to receive the. It was the only sacrament the Cathars recognized, a baptism of spirit that absolved all sin and elevated the recipient to the status of a perfect. To receive, it was to commit to a life of utter purity. But in these circumstances, it meant something else entirely. It was a conscious choice. They knew the fate of captured perfects was absolute, death by fire with no chance of recanting. They were choosing the pyre. 200 souls, one after another, willingly accepted their own death sentence. As the last rites were given, 4 men were chosen. And 2 guides who knew the mountain's secret paths like the lines on their own hands were among them. They were entrusted with the real treasure. As the fortress slept its last uneasy sleep, they slipped over the western wall, their precious cargo bound tightly. Their mission was not to fight or to escape for their own sakes. It was to ensure that the idea of the Cathar faith, its forbidden gospels and secret histories, did not perish with the people on the mountain. They were living books, carrying the library of a dying world into the wilderness, while behind them the wood for over 200 pyres was already being stacked. The rope was a frozen serpent, chafing their hands raw through thin leather gloves. Each downward slide was a controlled fall, a negotiation with gravity in a world without light or sound, save for the wind's low moan and the grating of hemp against stone. His feet searching for purchase on the rock face, felt the weight of the oilskin sack on his back not as a physical burden, but as the collective gravity of every soul they had left behind. Moved below him, a shadow detaching from other shadows, his breath pluming in the razor-thin air. They were not escaping death. They were carrying a life, a fragile idea pressed into ink and parchment, away from the fire that was coming for the bodies. When their feet finally touched solid ground, the silence was different. It was no longer the high, whistling silence of the peaks, but the dense, listening silence of the forest floor. Above them was a black tooth against a bruised purple sky, a tomb that was not yet sealed. No signal was given, no word spoken. They were four ghosts melting into the woods, their mountain craft the only prayer they had left. The snow underfoot was a traitor, a crisp white page ready to record their passage for the crusader patrols that circled the mountain like wolves. They moved from the shadow of one ancient pine to the next, their steps a whisper learned over a lifetime of hunting in these same woods. But tonight they were the prey. They carried no food, only the texts and small knives. Sustenance was a luxury for men who expected to live past the next dawn. Their mission was singular, to reach the caves of a labyrinth of subterranean passages known to the bonds as a final sanctuary, a library carved into the bones of the earth. But between them and that sanctuary lay miles of hostile territory, crawling with the soldiers of. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl was a potential death sentence. What hope did four men have against an army that had starved a mountain into submission? Hours bled into one another, measured only by the shifting constellations glimpsed through the canopy of branches. A flicker of orange light ahead, impossibly close, raised a hand and the four men became statues of ice and shadow, a patrol. The guttural sound of northern French dialects drifted through the trees, alien and brutal in the quiet of the night. They could smell the soldiers' cheap wine, the sweat of their horses. The men flattened themselves into a snowdrift behind a fallen log, the cold seeping into them, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs. One of the soldiers laughed, a loud, ugly sound that tore the fabric of the night. It felt like a sacrilege. The patrol passed, their torchlight painting dancing, monstrous shapes on the trees before finally receding, leaving a darkness that felt deeper, more menacing than before. They waited, not daring to breathe, until the only sound was the thudding of their own blood. They had survived their first test. How many more would there be? Back on the summit of the dawn of March 16th, 1244, arrived not with hope, but with a terrible, placid finality. The 15-day truce had expired. There were no more sounds of battle, no desperate cries or clang of steel. A profound calm had settled over the fortress, an atmosphere so serene it was unnerving. Inside the keep, the 205 believers who had received the sat together, not in fear, but in a state of quiet expectation. They had shed the world of flesh and fear. They were already citizens of another kingdom, merely waiting for the transport of flame to take them there. Père Roger Mirepoix, his face etched with exhaustion, walked out onto the ramparts, unarmed. He met the gaze of below, a silent acknowledgement that the game was over. The great gates of which had held back an army for 10 agonizing months were opened. The crusaders marched in, not to the chaos of a last stand, but to a scene of unnerving order. They found no one to fight. They found families huddled together, knights with their swords laid at their feet, and the black-robed perfects, their faces luminous with a conviction the soldiers could not comprehend. The Dominican inquisitors, led by the friar, were first through the gates, their eyes hungry not for souls, but for the fabled Cathar treasure. They were certain that the 15-day truce was a ruse to hide mountains of gold and silver. They tore the fortress apart. They ripped up floorboards, smashed coffers, and interrogated the defenders with cold, methodical fury. Where was the treasure? The Cathars only smiled, their silence a final, impenetrable shield. The soldiers found stores of grain, a few weapons, simple wooden furniture. They found nothing else. No gold, No silver chalices, no jeweled relics. The air inside the fortress was thick with the smell of old stone, damp wool, and something else. The scent of burning frustration from the inquisitors. His face contorted in a mask of rage, realized the truth. The wealth was a lie, a rumor they had chased up a mountain. Or perhaps the treasure was something else entirely. His eyes scanned the faces of the captured perfects, settling on their serene, knowing expressions. He understood then. He had been robbed, but not of gold. He had been robbed of the very idea he was sent to destroy. Outside, at the foot of the mountain, the construction was almost complete. For 2 days, soldiers had been felling trees, stacking them into a colossal, palisaded enclosure. It was not a gallows or a block, but a vast pen, filled to shoulder height with dry wood and straw. A pyre built for a congregation. The captive Cathars were led down the steep path from the fortress they had called home. They did not weep or struggle. Some were singing, a low, haunting melody that had no place in the world of the living. They were walked into the enclosure, over 200 men and women, and the gate was barred behind them. They were heretics, yes, but what kind of belief creates such martyrs? What idea could be so powerful that it made people walk calmly into the heart of a bonfire? The torch, a fist of pitch-soaked rag, described a lazy arc through the twilight and fell into the heart of the woodpile. For a moment there was only the soft whoomp of ignited straw, a hungry inhalation before the roar. The fire did not climb. It erupted, a blossoming orange flower of impossible size. It consumed the air, swallowing the sound of the Cathar hymns and replacing it with its own deafening, crackling sermon. The flames clawed their way up the palisade walls, turning the enclosure into a crucible, the faces within illuminated for one last, terrible instant, not in terror, but in a placid, unearthly calm. Some held hands. Others looked up towards the mountain peak, their expressions unreadable to the soldiers who gripped their spears and watched, their own faces slick with the sudden, radiating heat. Stood apart, his mailed fist resting on the pommel of his sword, a statue of grim duty. This was the end of a campaign, a task completed. Beside him, the Dominican leaned forward, his eyes wide, his lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps a curse. He was not watching a military victory. He was witnessing an exorcism, the violent purging of a defiant spirit from the very land itself. The heat was a physical blow pressing on the chests of the onlookers, and the smell was of pine and pitch, and then, sickeningly, something else entirely. Something that would cling to the stones and soil of for centuries. From their hiding place miles away, in a shallow depression on a wooded ridge, the 4 fugitives saw it. Not the pyre itself, but its reflection. A pulsating, obscene orange stain on the belly of the low-hanging clouds. The forest around them was cast in a fleeting, hellish twilight. Did not need to see the flames to feel their heat. It was a phantom warmth on his face, the ghost of his people's end. Sank to his knees in the snow, his head bowed, his broad shoulders shaking in a silence more profound than any scream. They were the memory now. The entire living library of their faith rested in the oilskin sacks on their backs, while the librarians themselves were turning to ash and smoke. What secret did those parchments hold that was worth more than 200 lives? It wasn't just a different interpretation of Scripture. Buried within the coded allegories and Gnostic genealogies was something far more dangerous, a lineage. a direct spiritual succession that they claimed bypassed Rome entirely, stretching back through the Bogomils of the Balkans, the Paulicians of Armenia, all the way to the disciples of the 1st century. It was a history that painted the Catholic Church not as the inheritor of Christ's legacy, but as its usurper. This was the threat, not heresy, but legitimacy. Their journey became a fever dream of cold and shadow. They moved through the night, following frozen stream beds and the game trails of boar and deer, their bodies fueled by a grief so vast it left no room for hunger or fatigue. The Pyrenees in March were a merciless beast. Snow gave way to slick, ice-coated rock, and the wind was a blade that flayed the warmth from their bones. Each step was a gamble, each gust of wind a threat to their precarious balance. Sometime before the false dawn, one of the other men, a weaver from whose name is lost to the records, slipped on a sheet of black ice. His fall was short, but the sound of his leg bone snapping was as loud as a thunderclap in the frozen silence. He made no cry. He only gritted his teeth, his face pale in the starlight, and fashioned a crude splint from branches and strips of their own tunics, but they all knew the truth. The man could not walk. To carry him would slow them to a crawl, ensuring their capture. To leave him was unthinkable. They were a chain, and a single broken link doomed them all. The weaver, propped against a rock, looked at them, his eyes clear of despair. He gestured to the sack he carried. "Take it." His voice was a dry rasp. "The body is a prison. You know this. Go." It was not a plea for his own life, but an order to save the mission. How does a faith prepare a man to embrace his own death so readily, to see it not as an end but as a release? They huddled in the lee of the rock as he spoke, the decision hanging in the air, heavier than the coming snow. Leaving him was a betrayal of their bond. Staying was a betrayal of the 200 who had burned to give them this chance. As they debated in hushed, agonized whispers, the weaver solved their dilemma. With a sudden, surprising strength, he pushed himself away from the rock, dragging his shattered leg, and began crawling back in the direction they had come. "I will lead them the wrong way," he whispered. "A gift, now go." He did not look back. They watched him drag himself into the darkness, a broken man offering his last moments as a decoy until the shadows took him. They went. The 2 sacks felt heavier now, weighted with the sacrifice of another soul. Back at the foot of, Friar walked through the smoldering remains of the pyre. The rising sun did little to warm the scene of absolute devastation. The smell was a physical presence, clinging to his robes. His soldiers were uneasy, their victory soured by the nature of its conclusion, but was not finished. His informants, men who had traded secrets for their lives in the final days of the siege, had spoken of a small group slipping over the walls. They had spoken of something being carried out. He now knew it was not gold. It was something he wanted more. He summoned a man named, a mercenary captain from the Basque country, the same man whose climbers had taken the Barbican. Was not a crusader, he was a hunter. His face was a mask of scars, and his eyes missed nothing. Offered him a bag of silver, its weight obscene in the gray morning light. 4 men, the Dominican said, his voice low and intense. They fled into the mountains. They carry books. I want the books. The men are irrelevant. Hefted the bag. He looked towards the jagged peaks, a landscape he knew better than any church. They will head for the high passes or the caves. They will think they are clever. He smiled, a joyless parting of thin lips. But the snow tells all stories. And the one remaining man, a young stonemason, found shelter as the sun rose, burrowing into a deep fissure between two massive boulders, a natural cave barely large enough for the three of them. Exhaustion was a physical poison, making their limbs tremble. Carefully opened one of the sacks, not to read, but to reassure himself. He unwrapped an oilskin layer to reveal a book bound in dark, unmarked leather. It was not one of their Gospels. He turned a page, his raw fingers clumsy. The parchment was covered not in text but in intricate drawings. They were not illustrations of saints or biblical scenes. They were diagrams of stars, constellations mapped with unnerving precision, with lines and symbols that were neither Latin nor Greek. In the center of one page was a complex seven-pointed star, and around its edge, a series of annotations in a cipher had only seen once in the private teachings of Bishop. It was a map, but not of any earthly terrain. What kind of knowledge were they carrying? Not just a history of their faith, but something else. A secret that the Cathars had guarded even from the majority of their own followers. A science of the heavens that Rome had declared diabolical. As carefully rewrapped the star chart, none of them saw it. A single, dark thread pulled loose from the seam of the oilskin sack when they scrambled into their hiding place. It lay starkly against the white snow just outside the fissure, a tiny, insignificant piece of evidence. Miles away, and his hunters were already cutting for sign, moving with the patient, relentless pace of wolves. He knelt examining the trail left by the weaver, the pathetic, smeared track of a man dragging himself to his death. Spat on the ground, a novice's trick. He cast his eyes further up the slope, ignoring the obvious lure, searching for the fainter, more desperate tracks of men trying not to be found. His gaze swept the landscape, and for a moment it seemed to pass right over the fissure where the three Cathars were hidden. His eyes, the color of wet slate, passed over the fissure without pause. There was nothing there to see. Just another shadow in a landscape built of them. But was a man who hunted not just what he saw, but what he did not. He read the landscape in its grammar, its syntax of wind and stone, and a single word was out of place. It was not the thread, that was too small, a detail lost in the vastness. It was the snow itself. Just to the left of the fissure's mouth, the crisp, wind-carved edge of a drift was softened, blurred, as if something had pressed against it and then withdrawn. An animal, perhaps, but animals left other signs, a scent on the air, a track. This was the sign of something trying to leave no sign at all. Inside the rock, the world had shrunk to the space between three men's bodies. The air was stale with the metallic tang of fear. The young stonemason had his eyes squeezed shut, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists around a piece of loose stone, as if he could crush it into dust through sheer will. Laid a heavy hand on his shoulder, a gesture not of comfort but of command. Stillness. Watched the sliver of bright, hostile daylight at the fissure's entrance, his mind a maelstrom. He was no longer a philosopher or a teacher. He was an animal in a burrow, sensing the predator circling just outside. He could hear the crunch of snow. One set of boots, close, terribly close. Moved with a liquid economy, his feet barely seeming to press into the snow. He stopped 10 paces from the fissure, his head cocked, listening to the wind. He was not looking for them anymore. He was waiting for them to reveal themselves. A cough, a shifting of weight, a prayer whispered too loudly. Silence was a weapon, and he was a master of it. His gaze dropped, and this time he saw it. The dark thread. It was nothing. A piece of homespun wool, likely from a peasant's cloak. But it was here, in the middle of nowhere, lying on snow that had been disturbed. It was a letter in the alphabet of the hunted. He now knew the word. The sun climbed, a merciless white eye, and the fissure that had been their sanctuary was becoming a trap. The cold was a physical entity, a thief stealing the heat from their blood. Hunger was a dull ache that had sharpened into a blade twisting in their bellies. Knew they couldn't stay. To wait for nightfall was to bring back his entire pack. He met's eyes over shaking form, and an entire conversation passed between them without a sound. They would have to run, now, in the full light of day. But how? The man outside was a patient spider, and they were the flies caught in the antechamber of his web. What hope remains when the hunter knows exactly where you hide? Took a single, deliberate step towards the opening. He unslung the short, heavy bow from his back. He was not preparing for a fight. He was preparing to kill men as they scrambled from a hole. The sheer, businesslike calm of the motion was more terrifying than any war cry. Inside could see the shadow of the man's arm fall across the entrance. He braced himself, not for an attack but for the end. He thought of the faces in the pyre, serene and illuminated. Was this all their sacrifice had bought? A few more hours of shivering in a crack in the rock. Then the mountain spoke. It was not a loud sound. It was a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from the stone around them, a vibration that traveled up from the soles of their feet into their bones. High above, on the sun-warmed southern face of the peak, a cornice of snow, overburdened by its own weight, finally surrendered to gravity. It was not an avalanche, not a roaring tide of white death. It was a release. 1,000 tons of snow and ice slid down a gully, a whispering, fast-moving river that scoured the mountainside. Heard the sound, and his hunter's instincts took over. He threw himself flat, his face pressed into the snow, as the river of white hissed past 100 yards away, its momentum carrying it down into the valley below with a final, booming crash that echoed off the peaks. The air filled with a fine, glittering mist of ice crystals. When it cleared, the landscape was changed. The gully was scoured clean. New drifts had formed. And the snow around the fissure, along with the telltale thread and the blurred edge of the drift, was buried under a fresh, pristine blanket of white. Rose to his feet, shaking the snow from his cloak. His face was a mask of cold fury. The mountain had erased the trail. He had been certain, but certainty was a luxury. He cast a final, lingering look at the fissure, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. But the evidence was gone. He could spend hours digging, or he could move on, casting a wider net. He turned and began to climb, moving away from them, his figure shrinking against the vastness of the rock and snow. They did not move for a long time. The silence left behind was more profound than the one that had come before. It was the silence of a reprieve, of a breath you didn't know you were holding until you finally let it out. His hand finally loosened on shoulder. The young man let out a ragged, silent sob. They had been given a miracle or a delay. In these mountains they were often the same thing. "He will be back," whispered, his voice hoarse. "He will circle. He knows the direction we must go." "Then we will go in a direction he does not expect," countered, his voice a low rumble. He pointed not up, towards the high passes, nor down, towards the relative safety of the forests. He pointed straight across the face of the mountain, towards a series of treacherous, ice-choked ledges known as the Shepherd's Ladder. It was a suicidal path in winter, a route no sane man would take, which was precisely why they had to. Their flight resumed, a desperate scramble against time and the elements. The Shepherd's Ladder was not a path, it was a suggestion, a series of handholds and footholds connected by faith and sheer nerve. The wind tore at them, a physical hand trying to pluck them from the rock. Below them, the world fell away into a dizzying white abyss. Every muscle screamed. The stonemason found a grim familiarity in the work. His hands, accustomed to shaping stone, now clinging to it for life. He moved with a slow, terrified precision, his youth a disadvantage against the patient endurance of the two older men. They moved for hours, their world reduced to the few feet of rock before them and the howling emptiness below. Hunger was no longer a pain, it was a hollowing out, a lightness in the head that made the world tilt and shimmer. They ate snow, a poor substitute for water that stole more heat than it gave. During a brief halt, huddled on a ledge no wider than a man's shoulders, felt a desperate need to confirm their purpose. He opened his own sack, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He bypassed the Gospels and drew out the other text, the one that felt heavier, denser. It was not a book but a collection of unbound parchments, brittle with age, wrapped in a sheet of cured leather. The writing was dense, a mix of Latin and a strange, angular Occitan script. It was a genealogy, but it did not begin with Adam or with Abraham. It began with a name, whispered only in the highest circles of the perfects, of Patmos. It traced a line, master to disciple, teacher to initiate, through figures whose names were anathema to Rome, the Constantine of, the shadowy founders of the Paulician and Bogomil movements. It was a meticulously documented tree of knowledge, a river of heresy that flowed through 1,000 years of darkness, right to their own teacher. This was the document that declared the Pope a fraud, and the Church of Rome a worldly empire built on a lie. This was worth dying for. But buried deep within the list of names, beside a 10th-century Bogomil priest from Bulgaria, was a marginal note, written in the same cipher as the star chart. Squinted, his mind sluggish from cold and exhaustion, it was a series of numbers. Coordinates, a date, and beside them a small, crudely drawn symbol, a fish. But the fish was swallowing a key. What ancient secret was so guarded that it had to be hidden within another secret? The texts were not just a history, they were a lockbox, and they had brought only a single cryptic key. Began to slip. His movements grew clumsy, his breathing ragged. The cold had found its way deep into him. As he reached for a handhold, his grip failed. He slid, his feet skittering on the ice, and only his iron grip on the back of his tunic stopped him from plummeting into the void. They hauled him back onto the ledge, his body limp, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of falling. It was the terror of the body giving up, betraying the will. "I cannot," he gasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I am slowing you down. Leave me." The words echoed the weaver's sacrifice, a terrible refrain in their journey. Looked at, his face a granite mask. They had left one man. Could they leave another? To do so would be to arrive at their destination as mere couriers, their own humanity stripped away, no better than the mercenaries who hunted them. It was a test, not of their bodies, but of the very faith they carried. Was the only for a peaceful room, or did it have meaning here on the edge of death? The teacher, the bonne, crawled over to the shivering boy. He did not offer empty words of encouragement. He looked into his eyes. "The weaver gave us a path," he said, his voice quiet but clear against the wind. "His body bought us time. Your body is a vessel for this work just as ours are. It will not fail because we will not let it." He took his freezing hands in his own. "The spirit is the fire, the body is just the wood it warms. Our fire will warm you." He began to recite one of the secret psalms, a text of pure light and spirit, a declaration of the soul's independence from its fleshy prison. Joined in, his deep voice a resonant bass line. It was not a prayer for rescue. It was an affirmation of what they were, a shield of words against the howling void. The sound was thin, almost lost in the wind, but on that ledge it was the only real thing in the world. They were no longer three fugitives, they were a church. Slowly, a flicker of strength returned to his eyes. The shivering subsided, replaced by a grim resolve. They would not leave him. They would carry him if they must. The chain would not break here. They roped themselves together with strips of leather cut from their belts, a physical bond to match the spiritual one. They were slower now, a single, struggling entity, but they were whole. As twilight began to bleed across the sky, staining the snow peaks violet and rose, they saw their next obstacle. The shepherd's ladder ended. To continue their westward journey, they had to cross a gorge, a black 50-foot slash in the mountain's side. In summer, a single, slender pine tree, felled by some long-dead shepherd, served as a bridge. Now that log was a nightmare of ice, a slick, rounded spine arching over a fatal drop. To cross, it would require a miracle of balance. To go around the gorge would take a day they did not have. From the direction they had come, far below them on the slopes, a tiny pinprick of light appeared. A torch had found their trail again. He had not circled. He had anticipated their desperate gamble, and he was climbing, relentless and patient, to cut them off. They were caught between the hunter and the abyss. The log was a bridge to either life or oblivion, and its toll was perfect balance. Did not speak. He untied the leather strip from his waist, the one that had bound him to, and handed one end to. He would go first, a human anchor, and they would follow his line. The pine trunk, broader than a man's torso, was coated in a lumpy, treacherous armor of ice, its surface reflecting the bruised purple of the evening sky. Below, the gorge was a throat that had swallowed the light whole. He placed a boot on the log, tested it. The ice gave a sick crunch, but the wood beneath was solid. He took another step, arms outstretched like a wire walker, his huge frame a stark silhouette against the snowfield on the far side. Each step was a negotiation with gravity, a silent prayer whispered from the soles of his feet. The wind was a bully, shoving at his shoulders, trying to unseat him. From their ledge, and could only watch, the leather strip playing out through his raw hands, a fragile thread of connection over the abyss. The torch below was no longer a pinprick. It was an eye, yellow and unblinking, and it was climbing faster. Was not following their path up the shepherd's ladder. He was taking a more direct, steeper route, a hunter's shortcut. He knew where the gorge was. He knew this log was the only crossing. He wasn't chasing them, he was moving to intercept them, was halfway across. He did not look down, he did not look back. His world had shrunk to the next few inches of ice. A breath, a slide. A correction. The sounds were intimate and terrifying, the scrape of his leather boots, the whisper of the wind, the frantic drumming of his own heart. He reached the other side with a final, lunging step, stumbling onto the solid rock of the far ledge. He turned, braced himself, and pulled the leather tether taut. It was turn. Secured the sack of parchments high on his back, the weight of 1,000 years of faith a precarious burden. He moved with a scholar's deliberation, not a mountaineer's confidence. He kept his eyes fixed on his face, a distant icon of determination. The gorge breathed cold air up at him, a miasma of vertigo and finality. He felt the pull of the emptiness, a seductive whisper promising an end to the cold, the fear, the running. He felt the tether tighten, taking up the slack, and focused on that physical link, that proof that he was not alone. He made it. Shaking, he scrambled onto the ledge beside, turning immediately to help. The boy was frozen. His face, already pale with cold, was now the color of old bone. He looked at the log, then at the torch, now close enough that they could see the shape of the man carrying it. Terror was a physical paralysis. His voice was sharp, cutting through the wind. "Look at me. Only at me. The log is just stone beneath your feet. The fire of your spirit is hotter than this ice. Come." It was the voice of his teacher, the voice of the... Took a hesitant step onto the log, his eyes locked with. He moved like a sleepwalker, his feet shuffling, his knuckles white where he gripped the tether they threw to him. He was a third of the way across when a gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed into the gorge. He swayed violently. His foot slipped. He fell not into the abyss but sideways, his weight dropping with a sickening jolt onto the rope. The shock tore through and pulling them towards the edge. Roared, digging his heels into the frozen ground, his muscles straining as he held the line. Scrabbled for a handhold, the leather burning his palms. Below them dangled, spinning slowly, a dead weight on the line, his eyes wide with shock. "Pull!" bellowed, his voice raw. They heaved together, a desperate, grunting rhythm. The leather stretched, groaning. Slowly, horribly slowly, they dragged the boy's dead weight up from the void. They hauled him over the lip of the ledge, where he collapsed, sobbing and shivering, into a heap. They had no time for relief. Was already back at the gorge's edge, his knife in his hand. He began hacking at the frozen roots where the pine bridge was anchored to the rock. The torch was 100 feet away now, its light dancing on his face. He was not hurrying. He watched them, his expression unreadable, a predator who knew the prey was cornered. "Hurry," urged, trying to get to his feet. The log was old, its wood softened by a century of mountain weather. His knife bit deep. With a final, furious wrench, he tore the log from its mooring. It balanced for a heart-stopping second, then pivoted slowly and plunged into the darkness of the gorge. A series of cracking, echoing booms followed as it shattered against the rock walls far below. They were safe. The path was gone. A shape detached itself from the rock on the other side. Stood at the edge, the 50-foot gap of empty air between them. He lowered his torch, planting its end in the snow. The light cast his face in harsh shadows. He showed no anger, no frustration. He simply watched them, his stillness more menacing than any threat. Then, with a fluid, economical motion, he unslung his bow, pushed and back, shielding them with his body. "Get behind the rocks." Knocked an arrow. His movements were unhurried, precise. He was a craftsman at his work. The three men stared, mesmerized by the terrible certainty of his actions. He was too far to guarantee a kill, but a wound, a crippling shot, was easily within his skill. They waited for the twang of the bowstring, for the hiss of the arrow that would maim or kill one of them. But the hunter was more cruel than that. The bow was drawn, a taut crescent against the dying light. And the arrow was not aimed at the defiant giant. It was not aimed at the leader. It was aimed at the sacks lying on the snow beside. The bowstring did not sing. It coughed, a dry, guttural sound in the thin air. The arrow was not a missile. It was a judgment, a sliver of fletched wood that would erase 1,000 years. Time stretched, becoming a thick, viscous thing. In that stretched moment, saw it all. Entrusting the parchments to him, the firelight catching the tremor in the old man's hands, the weaver's serene face as he walked toward the soldiers, the taste of melted snow on a tongue cracked with thirst. All of it funneled into the dark point of that arrow. It was aimed at the soul of their journey, let out a sound of pure negation, a growl that was half fury, half despair. He was a wall of muscle and faith, but a wall could not stop this. He took a half-step forward, an instinctive, useless gesture to shield the sacks, to put his own body between the hunter and the history. The choice had offered them was a masterpiece of cruelty. Let the truth die or die with it. It was who broke the spell. The boy who had dangled over the void moments before, who had been a dead weight of terror, moved. He was not galvanized by courage. He was moved by a different kind of fear, the terror of futility. He had seen a man die for this journey. He had nearly died himself. The thought that it could all end, not with a blade in the gut but with a flick of a distant man's wrist, was an absurdity his mind could not accept. His eyes, wide and wild, were not on his bow but on the ground at his own feet. The ledge they stood on was not solid bedrock. It was a shelf of fractured schist and loose scree, held in place by ice and gravity's fickle goodwill. He was a stonemason. He knew the breaking points of things. He didn't shout. He didn't warn them. He lunged not towards the sacks but towards a massive, precariously balanced boulder at the very lip of the ledge. He threw his entire, wiry weight against it, his shoulder striking the cold stone with a dull thud. For a second, nothing happened. The rock groaned, a deep, tectonic complaint. Then, with a shriek of scraping stone, it tilted. Saw the movement. His hunter's instinct, honed by a lifetime of reading the subtle shifts in the wild, screamed at him. He had a choice, the perfect shot or his own footing. He flinched, a minute involuntary recoil as the ledge across the chasm began to disintegrate. That flinch was enough. The arrow flew, not with the assassin's precision he intended, but with a slight, upward cant. It hissed over their heads and shattered against the rock face 20 feet behind them, its purpose unfulfilled. Then work truly began. The great boulder plunged into the gorge, and it took half the ledge with it. A wave of rock and ice cascaded downwards, a localized, man-made avalanche. Threw himself backward as the ground at the very edge of his side of the gorge crumbled away, widening the gap by another 10 feet. The roar was deafening, a grinding, echoing chaos that filled the world. When the dust and snow settled, a new silence fell. The chasm between them was wider, its edges raw and freshly broken. Stood, brushing himself off. His bow was still in his hand. His face, illuminated by the guttering torch, was not angry. It was something worse. It was appraising. He had underestimated them. He had seen them as sheep, and one had shown the teeth of a wolf. He raised a single hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of acknowledgement, a promise. Then he turned, and his torchlight was swallowed by the descending dark. He was not retreating. He was simply leaving. The mountain was a prison, and he was the jailer. He could afford to be patient. They collapsed, not in relief, but in sheer, soul-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a cold, trembling vacancy. Pulled away from the new, crumbling precipice, his hand on the boy's shoulder, now one of profound respect. The stonemason had saved them not with a sword, but with a stone. Their sanctuary for the night was a shallow wind hollow, a scoop in the rock that offered minimal protection from a wind that seemed to have teeth. They huddled together for warmth, three bodies pressed into one mass, listening to the mountain's lonely breathing. Hunger was no longer a companion, it was the host. It whispered lies in their ears, conjuring phantom smells of roasting meat and baking bread, a torment that gnawed at the edges of reason. In the faint, crystalline light of the stars, unwrapped the parchments. His fingers were so numb he could barely feel the brittle edges of the pages. He needed to look at them, to remind himself that the gnawing emptiness in his belly was for a purpose. He held the genealogy, the long river of forbidden names flowing back into the mists of the first centuries. Constantine. They were not just names, they were torches, passed from hand to hand through an age of darkness. His eyes fell again on the ciphered note, tucked beside the name of the 10th century Bogomil, the fish swallowing the key. He had seen it before as a symbol of their secret doctrine, the gnosis, the key, consumed by the initiate, the fish, an ancient Christian sign. But now, in the wake of their near oblivion, his mind made a different leap. The cold had stripped away the layers of scholastic interpretation, leaving behind only a raw, intuitive clarity. He thought of the star chart, the other document he had been forced to leave behind, the one that had guided them into these mountains. It had been more than a map. The constellations were marked with numbers, dates. This symbol, this fish, was also marked with numbers. They were not the same. They did not map the land or the sky. They were something else. His voice was a dry rasp. When you were a sailor before you found the faith. What does the fish mean to a man of the sea? Stirred, his voice thick with cold. Direction, food, life to the Greeks. A dolphin would carry the souls of the dead. Why? And a key. A key opens a lock, rumbled, his patience thin. This is not the time for riddles. We must sleep. We must find a way down at dawn. But was no longer with them, in the wind hollow. He was tracing the symbol with a numb finger, a fish that carries souls, a key that opens a lock. The numbers were not coordinates for a place on a map. What if they were coordinates for a place in a text, a book code? The key to unlock a hidden meaning. But which book? There were dozens of texts revered by the perfects, and then a memory surfaced, cold and clear as the stars above. A story had told him once, not as a lesson, but as a curious aside. He spoke of the great library of the Bulgarian at, a repository of Bogomil wisdom. When the Byzantines sacked the city in 971, the library was burned, but had smiled his thin, knowing smile. They burned the books, he'd said, but they could not burn the memory. Some things were carried out, not on parchment but in the minds of the initiates. They were rewritten but differently, hidden. A fish swallowing a key, a soul carrier. A secret preserved, looked from the cipher to the faces of his companions, shadowed and gaunt in the starlight. The guardian, The unlikely savior. They believed they were carrying a history, a legacy, a truth to be preserved and passed on. A terrible, exhilarating thought bloomed in his mind. What if they were wrong? What if this genealogy, this great river of heresy they had protected with their lives, was not the treasure at all? What if it was merely the box? What if the real secret, the one worth 1,000 years of persecution and a journey into this frozen hell, was not the list of names, but the tiny, cryptic note hidden within it? They had fled with the lock. But somewhere, perhaps in a book they did not possess, in a place they could not imagine, was the text that the key was meant to open. They had crossed the abyss, only to find themselves standing at the edge of a forgotten ocean. And they had no map, no ship, only the impossible riddle of a fish that had swallowed the sun.